Evening, everyone. So today we've got, I think it's our, I think it was it, fifth or sixth Carney's conversation, and we've got a guy called Athian who is about to join us now. Very interesting person. So hopefully this will be yet another interesting Carney's conversations. So we've just got should be with us shortly.
How you doing?
How's it going, Athian? You all right?
Yeah, I'm fine. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. Thanks for joining us on this live.
Yeah,
So,
thank you for having me.
so for people that don't know Athian, Athian's he's a member of the UK Youth Parliament and a campaigner for equality and knife crime. And I first got to know you when I saw your speech in Parliament around knife crime, which I think has actually got the most views on my Instagram page out
Really?
of all of my videos. So it shows that it was well met.
Thank
So
you.
do you want to? Atty, do you want to give us a quick? We normally start off with just getting a quick background in your life and what your upbringing was like and how things were for you growing up.
So I think what sort of prompted me to start campaigning is some of the stuff that I've experienced and seen other people experience because I'm from a working class community in inner city London. And I think it's about seeing that connection between what you see around you and the decisions made by politicians who are far detached from your community and trying to bridge that gap and try to change things and change the way that people perceive your community and politics and all those other things which are related.
Okay, well that sounds like a very good reason to get into it because I think that's one of the barriers of politics to a lot of the young people that we're working with.
Yeah.
Um, how did you get into politics? How did it start?
Um, So they have elections for the youth parliament every 2 years, and so they gave an assembly in front of my year saying who wants to run, and I did that, and then I somehow managed. I ran a campaign, and the fundamental idea that was at the core of the campaign was that knife crime isn't caused by a lack of stop and search. It's not caused by what some of the right wing media and politicians will tell you about. It's caused by deeply political issues like poverty, inequality, austerity. And I think that message managed to connect with people, and I won on that basis.
Yeah, well, I think that message definitely does connect with people. Now you've brought it up, so knife crime, that's a area that we focus on a lot of Carneys. I think we've had five participants killed via knife crime in the last two or 3 years. So it's impacted on us a lot. And yeah, we're often getting people suggesting that the best response is to increase police force size and increase stop and search, and that should stop it. But we strongly disagree with that and don't
Yeah.
think that is a way of stopping it. What was your campaign about, and what are your views on it?
So I think if we look at knife crime, it all fundamentally starts, a lot of the epidemic we're currently through in knife crime all started in 2008 with the financial crisis. So you saw a massive financial crisis all across the world where all the governments plunged into debt because of what cities in the city were doing. And so the government's response was to cut all forms of spending. They cut benefits, they cut education, they cut youth services, they cut mental health support. And I think that they basically shifted the cost of that financial crisis onto the poorest people. And of course, that pushes people in a direction where they're more likely to commit knife crime. I mean, we look all across the world, all the countries where you have the highest rates of crime are defined by low levels of education, high inequality, but a lack of opportunity. And I think it's a real distraction that politicians always talk about stop and search because they don't want to own up to the fact that those decisions contributed to knife crime. So it's a form of deflection, and they use it to rid themselves of any responsibility that they have in solving this crisis. And the last thing I'll say about this is austerity is a political decision. It's not an economic necessity. Even by economic terms, it hasn't paid off. We've had the slowest recovery out of any G20 country. And we all know that they did it for political reasons. They wanted to get rid of the welfare state for long before, and they finally found an opportunity to do it.
I mean, it's kind of common sense, isn't it? If you stop spending money on supporting disadvantaged groups, then the likelihood is it's going to result in anger, frustration, and violence. And I think if you look back historically at whenever we've gone through austerity in this country, youth violence has increased, and that's not a coincidence. That's because there's been less available for people. They're angry and frustrated, and the issues that tend to quite often lead to knife crime, youth violence, and things like that are not being dealt with properly. And as you said, a reduction in budget for things like mental health, for youth services, and things like that is clearly going to have a massive impact on it. And yeah, it's just frustrating when you see the public being sort of tricked into thinking actually what we really need to do is, rather than solve what's causing the problem, we need to deal with the consequences of that problem, and that's what we're going to increase stop and search, and we're going to increase the police powers, which arguably can actually increase knife crime rather than decrease it because of anger and frustration at the state.
And I think if we look, I mean, everyone's looking to America now. There's a lot of lessons we can learn for the sort of knife crime epidemic we're going through in Britain. If you look at America, it's a society defined by inequality. You have practically no welfare state. You have very little healthcare. You have no support for poor people, and they're much more violent society than Britain, and they spend more per capita than any other country in the world on policing, and yet they still have such a high murder rate. And I think that's an example of the direction that I think we're heading in the way that our politicians currently think about all these different things, and it's just the almost test case for everything that we shouldn't do. Yeah,
exactly. What not to do.
Yeah,
we seem to love to follow America and copy what they're doing. I put a post up about knife crime a couple of years back, and an American made a comment on it saying we needed to be more like America, because if we had more guns, then we'd be able to shoot people with knives. And I think he was actually seriously trying to make a point that having more guns will make a reduction in knife crime, and it's just
it's just nonsense.
What kind of thought process is that? It's ridiculous. So if say you were in power and you were able to prevent austerity, what would be the main things that you'd be focusing the money towards?
I think fundamentally there has to be a change in the way that we think about spending. It's not public expenditure, it's social investment. So what we can do is redistribute wealth from the corporations and individuals who are wealthy, and use that to provide a safety net for everyone in society. So we should, as the 6th richest country in the world, not have any homelessness. We shouldn't have children living in poverty. We shouldn't have teachers having to buy resources instead of having them in schools. We shouldn't have all these problems. All these problems are fundamentally political mistakes, and as a result of bad political thinking. And it all goes back to something that happened 40 years ago. So you had, after World War II, a massive period of reconstruction, the creation of the NHS, the creation of the welfare state, building more social housing than ever. But then, about 40 years after that happened, people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher came to the top of politics in Britain and America. And they started saying things like, government isn't the solution to the problem, government is the problem. They started saying things like, there's no such thing as society. So they basically reduced us into a way of thinking that we should only care about ourselves, we should only care about our families, we should only care about the people we know. And this idea that we owe nothing to anyone around us is a mess. We have, as individuals, as a society, a responsibility to look after people. I think it's something that we fundamentally have to do. So I'd use the power that governments have to provide safety nets in all those different areas, in education, in housing, in welfare. I think that's something we have to do as a society, otherwise we're going down a really dangerous path.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think when you talk about redistributing wealth, I think there'll be certain people in the sort of higher echelons saying, well, hold on, no, we don't want our wealth distributed. That's going to negatively impact on us. But my argument there would be it would make society that they live in a safer and a happier place. And essentially, it's actually going to improve things for them as well. It's not just going to improve things for people who are involved in things like knife crime and youth violence.
Totally.
And I think
no, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I think the reality is that knife crime and youth violence impacts on every sector of society, and not just the perpetrator, not just the victim, but everyone. And it's gonna benefit everyone to get that issue resolved.
Yeah, 100%. And I think there's an idea that when people who become wealthy don't become wealthy by themselves. I mean, if I start a business and have people working in my shop, the people who've done most of the work are the people in the shop. And I think we have to have an idea of wealth in society, which is about how does everyone who's a part of something see the rewards of it. So for the last 40 years, we've seen wages remain stagnant across the world. We've seen living standards remain stagnant. And it's about, we have to realize that businesses and wealthy individuals are only that because of the people that surround them and the people that work for them. And so the people that work for them should be able to have a fair wage. If you work however many hours, you shouldn't have to worry about paying your bills. It's something that shouldn't happen in society. And I think knife crime is something that affects everyone. And it's something that we have a collective interest in solving, as you rightfully said.
And I think what you've just highlighted kind of moves slightly into the Black Lives Matter debate as well, and especially with regards to talking about how the wealth should be distributed for businesses and companies and people that are working in those industries and companies. And obviously, hundreds of years back, it would have been black slaves that were helping people to make their riches, and there's still people benefiting today from slavery, and there's still people who are still facing the disadvantage of slavery because they still haven't had that wealth distributed fairly to them as well.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I think, as you rightly said, sort of the roots of globalization. So the entire global economic system we have today is based off the history of slavery. I mean, if we look at the transatlantic slave trade, it almost prompted the start of capitalism as we know it. We wouldn't have the global economy if it wasn't for slavery. We wouldn't have the kind of way that everything works if it wasn't for the foundation and creation of wealth that happened during slavery. And I think if we look at slightly more nuanced historical events like the French Revolution, wouldn't have, which is sort of, which people talk about in a very glorious manner and talk about as the start of ideas like fairness, human rights, equality. That wouldn't have happened without the production of French wealth in the colonies in South America. So I think this idea that slavery is a thing of the past and doesn't affect us today is just a nonsense idea. If you examine anything, you'll see the legacy of slavery and colonialism.
And what do you think about the idea that slavery is sort of still actually going on as well, because the wealth hasn't been distributed fairly, and that we are still reliant on the relatives of slaves who we're still arguably using in slave labour and things like the NHS and the National Transport Service as well. So I think it's what's your opinion on that?
So I think if we look at America, which is a lot of people are paying attention to now, there's this idea in America called the prison industrial complex. So America's economy, large sections of it are dependent on unpaid prison labor. So in the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution, there's basically a part that says slavery is illegal unless you're in prison. And so you have over-policing of predominantly African-American communities to basically provide labor for massive corporations that don't want to pay people fair wages. So this idea that slavery has ever been illegal in America is just nonsense. And if you just look at the 13th Amendment and the over-policing, even things like the war on drugs, they were all basically done to over-police and imprison African-Americans so they could be used for slave labor so corporations can make massive profits. Like, this idea that slavery is over is just nonsense.
And I suppose the whole American economy depends on it right now as well, which is why I suppose the Black Lives Matter movement is seen as such a risk to them.
Yeah, it's a threat to loads of their economy.
Yeah, because it's a huge part of their economy, the prison system, massively. And like you say, the war on drugs was definitely connected to that as well. With still not can't quite understand why the sentences for crack cocaine would be so different to the sentences for normal cocaine, other than the fact that who was seen to be using crack cocaine and who was seen to be using powdered cocaine, and actually, it shows complete unfairness in their legal system as well.
Yeah,
and I think we still get it over here as well. I think it still impacts on young people over here, and I think we spoke about knife crime earlier, but things like stop and search as well. It's something I've got a real issue with, and I know people will say, but okay, if you increase stop and searches, then you increase the amount of people that you find carrying weapons and carrying drugs. And okay, you do, but if you increase it on only one sector of society, but not on another sector of society, it shows that there are prejudices and that we're not living in an equal society at all.
Yeah, 100%. I think like 3% of the British population is black, but 12% of the prison population is black, and I think that just shows. It speaks to a lot of things you talk about. Harsher sentencing, more stop and search. I think you're 40 times more likely to be stopped and searched if you're black, and I think all these things show a deep unfairness at the heart of our criminal justice system, and I think it's punishing one group in so much worse than you do everyone else. And I think it's a major root of injustice in our country, and I think it's something we really need to tackle head on.
What are your thoughts of the recent protests?
I think they're 100% justified. I think it's been a long time coming, and I think we're really for several reasons. I think we're at the crossroads of major social transformation, and I think. But there's also something that we have to examine, that all these protests and all the statements from these corporations, companies, and politicians that Black Lives Matter came after someone had to be strangled to death by the police for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And it just shows the level of dehumanization, the level of ignorance, the level of racism that's embedded in so many different sections of our society, that you have to watch someone get killed for 8 minutes for us to act on it. And I think it's something we really have to examine, that why did it have to come to this? I mean, there are there's an endless list of names of African Americans who've been killed by the police. And I think we have to really examine, why did it have to come to this for us to do something?
Yeah, and I mean, what I'm hearing is lots of people talking about, well, it's a disgrace that they've damaged and destroyed statues in central London, but then actually all over the country. But then the argument back to that is, well, what's worse, that or being killed by being suffocated for nearly 9 minutes? It's again, we're looking at a consequence of something rather than looking at what the cause is, which I think is always, I think the biggest issue that we've got with society, and that's both over in America and over here as well. What do you think the protests over here have done for the Black Lives Matter community and their reputation?
I think the protests here have been, I think they've been slightly, I think the thing about the protests here is that the large sections of the media and the government are turning it into sort of some kind of culture war, where they basically use the things about statues and various different forms of nationalism to subvert and try and twist the message of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think we need to have less conversations about statues and more conversations about reform to the criminal justice system, about changes to stop and search, about more money for education, about an end to austerity. And this idea of endless talks about statues and vandalism is a real distraction from those points, because it's much easier if you're in government to talk about statues and talk about all those things than it is to actually have to put your time, money, and effort into tackling systemic racism. And I think we need to talk less about statues and more about real systemic reform to our society.
So we're obviously encouraging lots of our participants, the older ones, to vote, and we're encouraging the younger ones to learn about politics so they can get involved and vote. One of the things that gets sort of thrown back at us quite a lot is, why would they vote in a political system that is systemically racist and systemically flawed? What would your response to that be?
I think politics, and the worst things about politics, thrives on people being apathetic. It thrives on people not caring, not thinking that they can make any change to society, not thinking that their vote matters. But if we look at every single general election, we hand over massive power to the people that we elect. And so if we looked at the last general election, the amount of votes that the Conservative got was less than the amount of people who didn't vote. And imagine how much different things could be all across the world if there was more political engagement, if more people were involved in voting, if more people looked at politics and said that there's something I can change by choosing which political party is in power. And I think that a real example is that, so in 2015 and around that time, David Cameron basically proposed that we should introduce voter ID to decide who votes. And I think there's a very conscious reason for why they did it. It's something called voter suppression. It's basically where you create barriers for certain people to vote. And I think we know that poor people, ethnic minorities, black people are less likely to have ID, right? So that move was basically, they haven't implemented it, it's sort of in the talks, but the fact that they suggested that showed that there is power in people voting. And I mean, if you look at America a couple of weeks ago, they had some primary elections, which is sort of related to who becomes the president. And they put less polling stations in black areas. They make people queue up for a really long time. So if people can be bothered, the people, right-wing people in governments all across the world, can be bothered to suppress people's votes, can be bothered to make it more difficult for minorities to vote, then that means there is some kind of power in voting. And I think we should recognize that and go out and vote for parties which are going to serve our communities and serve us.
Yes, I suppose if the political parties see that a certain sector of society is voting and they do count, and they're going to potentially decide who's in power, then they're going to start creating policies that are going to hopefully help that sector of society.
100%.
Although the other thing that people argue against us with is saying that if we're voting, all we're voting for is a guess on who's going to lie the least. And I think that's a pretty fair one. And I think the issue is you get things like, one of the things I've like, people who know me at Carney's, they'll know I use this example all of the time. But one of the things that I can't get is if I decide I'm going to set up a toothpaste making company, and I go and make an advert and say, this toothpaste will actually turn your teeth into diamonds, I won't be allowed to put that advert out because it's advertising trading standards and I'm telling a lie. However, if a politician say, if I were to get in power, I would create however many affordable housing, and then they get into power and they say, oh, actually, no, didn't think about this, that, and the other, and actually we're only going to make 5% of what we said we were going to do. Getting your head around that and how that's okay, that you're voting for people and their policies, but then their policies are changing once they're in power.
Yeah. And I think there are loads of legitimate concerns about the way that our political system works. And I'm not going to sit here and say that there aren't. But I think there are things that we need to do to change this. And I think one of them is creating more accountability for politicians. We need to have some democratic ways of making sure that while they're in power, they follow what they do. So sort of elections that happen in between when a government goes into power and when their next general election is. And I think the way that our political system in this country works isn't 100% right, and I think there are some legitimate problems. But even then, being engaged and making sure that if a government doesn't do what they say they're going to do, that we vote them out at the next general election is something that's quite powerful, and I think we should realise the power of that. And I think politics isn't just about voting. There are other things we can do, organising our communities, trying to do activism, trying to change the way that people think and view different issues in society is equally as important as voting.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so what would your advice to be to people who are interested in, well, actually, no, before I ask you that, what is your aim? Is your aim to get to remain involved with politics?
Yeah, so sort of in the medium term, I think I'm probably going to become a lawyer, do some human rights work and sort of become a human rights barrister, because I think there is a real power in knowing the law and being able to help people, and then sort of become an MP, then see how far I can go in politics. So I think the thing you have to remember is that saying, if I said I wanted to be Prime Minister or I want to be this or that, I think there's a realization that those things happen as a result of luck, and it's a lot of times chance and being at the right place at the right time, believing the right thing for the people who want to vote for you. But being able to do things in your community, being able to help people, being able to change the way that people think about things, those are things which are within your control and you can do. And I think if I do become Prime Minister, that would be great. But I think there are loads of other things that we can more easily and accessibly do.
And what would be your main policies?
I think it would depend on the time, but I think the fundamental idea I have about politics is one of them is that we need to build sort of broader coalitions. So if we look across America and Britain, we have two main groups who sit at the sharp end of the government's policies. So you have people in what you call left behind coastal areas, which used to be the sort of hubs of manufacturing. But as a result of globalization, those jobs have moved abroad, and there's loads of deprivation and lack of opportunity in those areas. But then equally, if we come to the inner cities like London, we have similar problems: lack of economic opportunity, low levels of education, high deprivation. And I think really creating a strong welfare state, a strong NHS, shielding everyone from poverty, creating that safety net for everyone is really important. And I think another one is climate change. I think climate change is an existential threat to our world, our society. And I think we have to tackle that head on. Otherwise, we literally there's no other planet we can live on. This is the only one we've got. And I think we need to be careful about the way we handle this one. And I think an idea that fuses those two together is this idea of a Green New Deal. So it's basically where you get billions of pounds of economic investment in green infrastructure and technology. But the idea is that you target those jobs and that education in low-income areas, and you can really use it to redistribute wealth and power to those who don't have it. And I think it's an idea of you can be in the government to stand up for those who are on the back foot in society. And I think that's something that we need more politicians that do that and believe that. Because I think politics is something you can really use politics to transform society in loads of different ways. And I think we need less of a detached elite in politics. We need people who from our communities, who know us, who understand our struggles. And I think that's sort of an approach I take.
Well, I think that's that's kind of the answer to one of the previous questions I gave around how do we make politics more of a fairer system that works properly. And I think it is by getting a wider range of people involved in it. And I think generally, when you look at the politicians out there, they're generally from a certain social and racial background, and it's not necessarily a fair representation of society. And so we've got people who really haven't got a clue about what's going on the ground. And I mean, before setting up Carney's, I worked for the council for a number of years, and the frustration of working at the council was all the decisions were being made by the people up at the top who had no experience of what it's like down on the ground and doing the sort of working at the coalface. So I think the more we can get people like you, other young people coming up who are coming from a variety of backgrounds, but who are still allowed to fit in, because the impression I get from when I've been down to the Houses of Parliament is that it's quite an exclusive place to go to, and you have to know how to dress, how to talk, how to communicate, and I think that could probably be a little bit off-putting for certain sectors of society. So I think there's room for that kind of thing to change as well.
Yeah, because I think if we look, I think we're in some ways worse at representation of people in Britain than they are in America. So I think if you look at politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's a congresswoman for, I think it's the Bronx in New York. Yeah. And if you look at the way she speaks and the way that she can connect with people, you can see that she's from that community, that her understanding of society isn't based off reading books or having a theoretical understanding of society, which is important. I'm not going to say you shouldn't know about economics or politics or all those different things, but you have to bridge that knowledge with actually being in the community. And I think you have too many people who run this country whose only understanding of the country is through books and sort of formalized knowledge. That means they basically make decisions which don't actually make sense if you have any lived experience of the policies that they're working on. Yeah,
I mean, where we're based in Battersea, we need to get you down, actually. You need to get you down to these sessions with us once we open back up. But we're in Battersea, and we've got a couple of housing estates on one side, and then we've got Prince of Wales Drive on the other side, which is multi-million-pound houses. And we've essentially got two different communities living there, and they don't really communicate, interact, or know anything that's going on. So like when we've had some of the people from the wealthier parts come down and speak to us and say, oh, well, why have you got a project working with young offenders around here? We don't really have issues around knife crime. And we say, well, actually, we've had 3 people stabbed in the last 3 weeks. It's like, really? But because they just don't really connect at all. And I think that's a big problem that we've got, is there's a lack of connection there. And I think there's also a lack of social mobility. And this is one of the things that we're really trying to invest in. And it's worked really well, actually. We've got some people who come down to Carney's who are from a wealthier background, who are mixing with some of our other participants and providing opportunities and helping them climb up that sort of social ladder. But I think if we want young people to move away from crime and antisocial behaviour, we've got to give them opportunities to see how they can make a success of themselves. And I worked with some of the most intelligent people I've ever met, but because they haven't had that opportunity, they might have turned and gone to use an illegitimate way of earning a living. But I firmly believe that the vast majority of them, if they had the opportunity to earn money legit, they would have gone for that. But yeah, I think 100%. The way our benefit system is set up and the way opportunities are set up, it quite often doesn't happen, and it needs to be spread a bit more evenly and a bit more fairly.
Yeah, I think this country has a massive crisis with social mobility. So I live in a council house, I get free school meals, and I think I'm relatively lucky in that I've had some opportunities where I can realize my potential and what I want to do. But I think if I look at some of the people around me, I'm no smarter. I don't know anything more than them. It's just that I've been lucky to have certain opportunities. And I think we have a major crisis in this country that too often it's where you're born that decides where you'll end up. Because I think if even in Camden, if you live, there are 2 areas, and if you live in those 2 areas, it can make a difference between 10 years in life expectancy. And I think that just shows how messed up of a society we have. That where you live is the single most important thing for how long you'll be alive for. And I think it's something that our politicians simply don't know about. I mean, if you've only ever gone to a private school, then you go to a brilliant university, then you end up in the House of Commons, then end up being the leader of the Conservative Party, then you're in government. You have no real understanding of what it's like to be in this country, the barriers that we face, the problems with the welfare system, the problem with social housing, the problems with education. And I think one thing that I'd push for, and one thing that I plan on working for in the future, is trying to bridge the gap between our communities and those who are in power. And I think we really need mass participation in politics. We need, in progressive parties, I think we need structures for how we can get people in our communities who don't necessarily find a natural place in politics, how we can give them skills, training, accessibility to these places. Because I think it's enough if some politicians in the Labour Party say, oh, we want to see more politicians from diverse backgrounds, and say we'll sit back and do nothing about it, that's not very useful. What they actually need to do is put in some structures in place where, if I'm a person, I live in Camden, if I live here, my MP is someone that I can identify with. If you live in Battersea, your MP should be someone that you identify with. If you live in some part of the north of England, your MP should be someone you identify with. And I think that's fundamentally what's wrong with our politics across the world. You have a detached elite who are making decisions with no real understanding of real life, based only on books and knowledge, and not informed by lived experience. And I think that's something that's really holding us back, and that's something we massively need to change.
Well, I mean, an example of that I remember, I can't remember which politician it was, but there was an argument around benefits and the job seekers allowance being too low, and you can't survive off of it. And this politician said that he'd done a trial where he'd lived, I think, for 4 weeks just off of benefits, and he managed just fine. And then when it was looked into, he managed just fine in his house that he doesn't need to pay any rent on, with a full fridge, with loads of other benefits, that not including paying for his mobile phone, paying for his council tax, paying for all that sort of stuff. He just used the benefits as disposable wage, which is not how people on benefits use it. They have to use it to get their food, to have to pay for their gas and their electricity. It's a completely different experience that I think, it's essential that people running our country need to represent all different classes and backgrounds.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's a thing that's really holding us back. And I think it's something that's going to change after this pandemic. So if we look all across the world, particularly in America and Britain, you have more people than ever who are reliant on the welfare state. And these people who've probably gone their entire lives without it. And I think there's an increasing awareness across all parts of society that our current social security system, our current benefit system is entirely broken. And I think there's going to be, hopefully, an increased will and desire to change that after this crisis, because there's going to be an increased awareness of what it's actually like. It's not going to be, because I think in 2015, David Cameron very purposefully demonized people who have benefits. And I think now, hopefully, we'll increasingly as a society be able to tell that this demonization was nonsense used to justify terrible political decisions. And I think we're at a point of social, economic, and political transformation. I think we're generally going to be going down a very different path from what we were going to if this pandemic never happened.
So how do you think, now you're talking about the pandemic, how do you think that's impacted on society, and what do you think the outcome is going to be?
I think any form of crisis, and I think we've seen it before, exposes problems with your government and exposes inequalities in your society. And I think the coronavirus pandemic has been no different. If we look at it, it's exposed just how bad our benefit system is, just how inefficient our government is at ruling. I think we have like the highest death toll in Europe. And I think now there's an increasing awareness that who we put in power is really important, that the decisions they make really do impact us, that we need people who are more compassionate, who believe more in equality, who believe in justice. And I think hopefully we can use this time to not go back to normal, but try and build something back that's better, try and tackle those inequalities. Because I think we can't go back to normal. Normal wasn't great. We had massive levels of inequality, high levels of child poverty, loads of different problems with our society. That finally, now that everything has slowed down, we can really use this as a moment to rethink, reconsider, and redesign society to be more just, equal, and fair. And I think hopefully we use this time to realize that we don't have to go back to normal, that we can create something brighter and better.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also what's highlighted to us is that there's also a lot of people out there that do care and do want to help other people from other backgrounds. So we've like lots of other organisations, we've had to change the way we're doing things. So we're doing lots of food deliveries and things like that. And the amount of people that have donated, the amount of people that want to come and volunteer and help, we have to turn potential volunteers away. And they're coming from all different social backgrounds. And then with everything that's going on with Black Lives Matters, I'm hoping all of this is a sign of a new time to come. Yeah. Because I think it's been really positive. But as you say, I think what's really important and what needs to not be forgotten is that when this pandemic's over, like you say, we don't go back to normal. We still insist these changes are happening. The protests that are going on at the moment, great, get the word out there. But we need to make sure there's some more substance in it, and that there are actually going to be changes that are going to be made, and people aren't going to just sit down and settle for what happens in the good old days, because they're not good old days. That's what we want to try and move away from, and we want to try and progress from. So I think it's about actions following on from the pandemic.
100%.
How's it impacted on you yourself? Because you're still in education, aren't you?
Yeah, so I'm year 12. Yeah. So everything's just a bit messed up, but hopefully we'll go back to some kind of routine soon. But yeah, it's kind of messed everything up.
And what's your plans for yourself with regards to your education?
So I'm in year 12 now, so I'm doing exams next year. And so I do A-level history, geography, English. And so I'm going to apply to do history at Cambridge. Hopefully I get in. Then I'm going to do a law conversion degree, then go into law. And I think that's sort of the plan. Hopefully I can get a Stormzy scholarship. Who knows? That's why I get in.
We had Stormzy on a couple of weeks ago, and I know you asked a question in that one. And we'll definitely be suggesting you as someone to be put forward through his scheme. So I think
hopefully I can get in.
And I mean, so education, how important is it? Because I think, clearly you're a very educated person. You've done your research, but how much importance would you place in education?
I think education is really quite powerful. I think one person that's sort of inspired me to do some of the stuff I've done is an activist. He's a musician. His name's Akala. Have you heard of him?
Legends,
Yeah,
absolute
yeah, yeah.
legends,
Akala's
absolute
great.
legend,
I think if you,
genius.
yeah, he's a real genius. If you look at him, he's a person whose story is quite an interesting testimony of the power of education. So he went to school in Camden. He went to a school that's close to where I live, and um, he he didn't go to university. He dropped out of school when he was a teenager, but yet all that he's done is through self-education. And I think that shows the power that you can have when you decide to learn things. And I think our schools do a terrible job of teaching people just how great education and learning could be. I mean, they manage to make it as boring as is possible, when actually education is something which allows you to understand, to navigate, to look at the world in a critical way, to reimagine it, to decide what you want to do. And I think it's something that we really need to try and change in society. Education should be something that everyone is interested in. It shouldn't be something that's for a select group of people who are at the top and who are the elite. Education is something that that everyone should be able to engage with. Everyone should be able to have a chance to really learn about what they're interested in. And I think education is probably the most powerful thing that any of us have, to be able to understand and reimagine and redesign the world. It's all based off what we learn and what we decide to take in and absorb.
And as you say, the understanding that education isn't just the way that people are educated at school. It can be around self-educating yourself. We've spoken on kind of conversations before about the issues with the education system that we've got in our country, which is not really fit for purpose. It's set up where you're only able to learn in one sort of way, and if that's not your way of learning, then you're going to get pushed out and you're never going to succeed. So yeah, I 100% think there needs to be a lot of self-education, but I also think the education system needs to be changed up so it allows for other learning styles, so that people can recognise actually that whilst they might not be book smart, they're very intelligent in other ways. As I say, a lot of the young people we're working with are complete and utter geniuses, but just didn't get on that well at school.
Yeah.
And I think obviously a massive factor with education is education needs to be inclusive, and it needs to be inclusive of the most at need. However, what we've got at the moment is an education a system that excludes the most in need. And so you find so many people out of mainstream education and in pupil referral units who just don't have the funding or the capacity to be able to deal with them. And in my experience, the biggest crime prevention factor ever is mainstream education. If you can get into mainstream education and maintain it, your chances of going to prison are massively, massively dropped. As soon as you're excluded from mainstream education, your chances of going to prison massively increase. And it's sort of a sign of the society that you were talking about earlier, that we do tend to find those who are most in need of inclusion and exclude. And that's something I think massively needs to change as well.
Yeah, 100%. I think school exclusion is really terrible. I think I remember a former director of the British Prison Service said that as soon as you exclude a young person, you might as well give them a prison sentence.
Yeah.
Because it's like, they don't even provide any alternative for after you've been excluded from school, and the alternatives aren't great. And I think if we look at Glasgow, which used to have a massive knife crime problem, their decision to dramatically, they nearly have, they had 0 school exclusions last year. Their decision to do that has massively decrease their levels of knife crime. Because, I mean, we have a problem with our society that we decide to invest in people at the wrong place. So instead of subsidizing people to succeed, instead of providing people with good housing, good education, good healthcare, we decide to save as much money as we can at the earliest possible point to spend massively later. Because putting people in prison is really expensive. So why not just educate people, provide people with opportunities so they can go and have productive lives and get jobs? But no, we'd rather spend loads of money on excluding people and putting them in prison later on. And I think it speaks to your society how much you invest in young people. How much do you give the most excluded young people opportunity? That is a sign of what your society values, how you view everyone. And I think it's something we need to really face head on.
And do you think, because I've heard that people have, quite often around, especially around the policy on prisons and crime, that actually it's voters who are most keen to see people get longer sentences and harsher sentences, because the voters are the ones who essentially are more focused on revenge than they are on rehabilitation. And I suppose, well, I'm answering my own question really, but the way of challenging that again is education and experience,
Yeah.
and getting them to learn and understand where these people are coming from, what could have been the potential cause of the offence. I mean, I've heard a ridiculous story the other day, which so a young girl attacked her mum, scratched up her face. Mum called the police. The girl was arrested, taken to court. She was charged and fined. Because she's under 16, the mum had to pay the fine. Because the mum refused to pay the fine for her being attacked, she was then put in prison for 3 days, which is just, it's this.
We have a terrible criminal justice system.
Yeah, exactly. It's unbelievable, and there needs to be more where we're looking into the actual history behind the offence, and what the causes of that offence was, what led to that, why a certain person's offended and certain other people haven't. There's always reasons. We're not a nation of psychopaths who just decide, I'm going to go out and commit crime. We're products of our environment, and if our environment is positive, that's what our product is. If our environment is negative, then again, that's what our product is. We're working with young people who have been grown up with intergenerational offending, worklessness, mental health issues, substance misuse. Those are systems that need to be broken and stopped, and we need to change that cycle. But instead, we just punish them, and we carry on feeding into that cycle by, right, we'll kick you out of school, we'll then put you in prison, you'll follow your dad, your granddad, your great-granddad's steps, and we'll still act surprised at the fact that you're not going to be reformed at the end of it all.
Yeah. I mean, imagine if we all took a sociological view of crime, because I think everyone can understand no one really wants to commit crime. If anyone had any other option, they wouldn't do it. And so, like, we should just as a society step back and be like, why don't we just provide people with education, housing, healthcare, and we'll have dramatically less crime. We'll have people imagine how much wasted potential there is in prisons. Imagine all the other things that people could have given us to their families, to their society, to their community, but instead they spend most of their life locked up in a box. It's like, why are we doing this as a society? It's kind of revenge rather than rehabilitation, right? I think there needs to be a collective realization that everything there is hasn't always been. That we can decide that this is wrong, we want to change this. And if we start to push our politicians into changing the way they think about crime, that they need to be more tough on the causes of crime than they are on actual sort of crime that's in the street, I think we could see we could live in a really different society.
And I think it kind of comes back to your point that you were saying around, you don't just change politics by being a politician. And this is where other young people and other members of society can come and get involved. And it is around campaigning for things like this. It is around educating other people for things like this. One of the programs we found that works really well is we work with an organisation called, why's their name popped out of my head? Leaders Quest. And they get the chief exec of all the main big companies. They'll come down and they'll come and sit and talk to some of the participants from Carney's, and they'll learn leadership skills from people that have spent 4 or 5 years in prison, or who's been shot or who's been stabbed, and they'll recognise the potential that those people have got, and then they'll learn from that and move forward with it. And I think that's really important. People need to be aware of what's going on for other people from other backgrounds. They've got to, and rather than just making an assumption that they know what's going on, they've got to come and talk to them. They've got to find out the stories, and they've got to look at what's going on in the background.
100%.
And then equally, people have got to be willing to come out there and talk and say how things have experienced, how their experience has been of things. I mean, one of the other programs we're trying to set up actually would be useful to get your points of view on this. So we've formed a consortium with a number of other organisations in Battersea. So we've got Providence House, Keys House, Catherine Low Settlement, St Peter's, and we're trying to work with a long-term plan on how to improve things in the Battersea community. And one of the roles that we've just started to advertise for is the Battersea Youth Voice Coordinator. And what we want them to do is we want them to get the voice of young people, but not just any young people that have been through the experiences of what we're trying to change. So when we're looking at the change in the mental health system, we want young people who have been sectioned, who have been involved in the mental health system. When we're looking at education, we want the young people who've been excluded. And when we're looking at criminal justice reform, we want the young people who've been included, who've been impacted by crime and who've spent time in custody. Because I think what we quite often do is generalize around young people and say, oh, let's get a young person's point of view on this. But actually, it's not about getting just a young person's point of view. It's getting the relevant young person's point of view who has a lived experience of this, where they can then essentially act as a consultant and advise you on what works and what doesn't work.
100%. Because I think it's the role of organizers and activists to try and bring the people who are most affected by an issue and give them the space and platform to speak to those who make the decisions. Because I think too often as a society we over value sort of theoretical knowledge of a problem, and we undervalue lived experience. And it's about bridging those two together. Because I think if we had people who've spent long times in prison talking about how we can better rehabilitate people and lower reoffending, that'd be much more powerful than a person who spent years studying how we can redesign our prison system. If we have someone who's been affected by school exclusion and we get them to speak to head teachers and those who make those decisions, that's more powerful than someone who sits back and reads about school exclusion. And I think it's about really increasing participation and introducing democracy into our institutions. So I think there needs to be more feedback between those who use services and the way those services are designed. Because I think there's too often a disconnect. And I think institutions can only work well if they're accountable and can be changed by those who use them. And I think that's a major problem. We need to extend democracy to more parts of our society. And I think the projects that you've talked about there are really powerful examples of how that can be done.
100%. And in my experience as well, people are open to listening to other people's views, and they do take it on board. It's just it's creating that opportunity for it to happen. Like we've seen it many times when we've delivered presentations, and we'll bring young people along who've been affected by whatever it is we're presenting on. People listen to them and they value what they've got to say, and in fact they probably listen to them a lot more than they listen to me, because this is someone who's actually been through it. So it's like you say, it's creating more of a platform for them to be able to do that.
And I think, like exactly what you were saying, I think in our society we have a really broken perception of whose knowledge we should value. So I think Akala he spoke at the Oxford Union about, he gave a sort of talk about 100 years of and I think it was like 1,000 years of lost African history. And before he went to the Oxford Union, he'd been giving this speech over and over again at some prisons in Manchester. And he basically talked about how the people in the prisons who were serving long sentences asked better questions than the people who were at the Oxford Union. I think that's an example of just how crazy our perception of knowledge is. Like, those are supposed to be the smartest people in the country, and people who are serving prison in life are asking better questions. That shows that everyone has something to contribute. Everyone has some knowledge to contribute. Everyone has something to give us. I think there needs to be an increasing recognition from everyone that everyone has knowledge to give us. Everyone has something meaningful and impactful to say. And I think that's something that a lot of people who are in power need to recognize and take on board and actually do something about.
Yeah, no, definitely, 100%. Right, we're almost coming to the end. I think we've only got 5 minutes left of this. So I had two quick questions that I wanted to ask you as well. The first thing was, what's inspired you? Like, you're doing a lot. You're being an activist yourself. You're getting yourself educated. You've got a plan. What's your inspiration?
I think, people ask me this a lot. I never have a good answer. But I think I've talked about Khalid a lot, but I've read his book. He has a book called, what's it called? It's called Natives, Class and Race in the Ruins of Empire. And I think it's a really powerful book, and it's a testament of what knowledge can be. And I think the way that he combines his own experiences with the work that he's done as an activist is really inspirational. I think he's a person whose knowledge and expertise is really like quite respected across society. He did a live a couple of days ago, and he had 20,000 people on there listening to what he had to say about sort of the Black Lives Matter movement and all these different things. And I think he's a really inspirational person who's used his own personal experience to try and change things for his community. And I think that's one person that really massively inspires me.
All right. My second question is, what one bit of advice would you give to some of our participants who might be watching this live now?
I think one is to realize the power we have. I think if we look at all the problems we have in the world, it's a small number of people who are making some terrible decisions. And we have to realize that if we come together, if we decide to act, if we decide to take them head on, that we can really change things. I mean, progress doesn't just fall from the skies. It happens when people organize, when people work together, when we realize what we have in common. There's this idea of shared vulnerabilities. So that you have too long of an answer, but you have two different types of communities. You have communities of strength. So that's sort of attributes we have, our nationality. But we also have communities of vulnerability. So that's things that we sharely are vulnerable: poverty, homelessness, all these other issues. And I think we need to form more communities of vulnerability and realize that the issues that we have together, the problems that we share, are things that we should organize around and try and tackle together. And I think we have to realize the immense power that we have, and the Black Lives Matter movement and different movements across the world are showing that if we come together, if we put our differences aside, if we realize the problems we have together, we can really radically transform society in the way that it works to work for us normal people.
I think that's some very, very good advice.
Thank you.
Very good advice. All right. Well, I think we'll end it there because we're literally coming up to the end now. But massive thank you for this. This has been like, there's been loads of comments about how educated people have been now just through speaking to you. And
thank you for having me.
Hopefully quite a few people are going to be looking up Akala now as well, and see some more inspirational stuff going on there. But yeah, we definitely need to get you to come down to Carney when we're back up and running, and we'll get you to do a couple of sessions with us and get you to speak to some of our participants as well, and hopefully you can act as an inspiration to them as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think we should definitely work together in the future. I think we can do some great stuff.
Definitely.
Thank you.
All right, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Athian, and I will speak to you soon.
Yep, thank you for having me. Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.